Okay. So hello everyone. I hope you had a nice poster session and have a great afternoon or morning if you are joining us from US, I believe. Before I will introduce our host, first of all, my name is Tomek Wodarski. I'm postdoc working on biophysics at University College London. And I'm also in the Polonium Foundation. I am a scientific content manager. And today I will be chairing this session. But before I will introduce our keynote speaker, I would like to give you some technical details about this session. So of course we will have a Q&A session after Magdalena's presentation. And in order to ask the question, you have two options. First one is to post the question in the Q&A section. And the second one is to raise your hand. And then I will, at the end of the presentation, I will unmute you and allow you to ask the question directly to our speaker. So you have two options depending on your preferences. We will try to cover as many questions as possible. And yeah, and there is also a chat window. So it's more for like informal discussions. Yeah. All right. So I think that's that from the technical part. So now I will have a great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker for the SPP 2021 conference, Magdalena Skipper. She is editor-in-chief of Nature and the chief editorial advisor for the Nature portfolio. She's a geneticist by training. She obtained PhD at the University of Cambridge, working on investigating the sex determination system in C. elegans. Then she covered two postdoc positions in MRC, LMB, and cancer research. And finally, in 2001, she moved to Nature Publishing, where she works till today. She has extensive editorial and publishing experience as she worked as a chief editor of Nature Review Genetics, senior editor for Genetics and Genomics of Nature, and editor-in-chief of Nature Communication. In 2018, she co-launched the Nature Research Inspiring Science Award for Women Early Career Researchers. I believe there is a deadline in June this year for this year prize, as far as I briefly checked. And of course, Magda's other interests are, many other interests involve reproducibility in science and collaboration in science. And I believe we will hear more about the latest, the collaboration part of her interest today. So without further ado, Magda, the Zoom is yours. I stop my sharing screen, and if you can.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tomek, for this very kind introduction, and thank you for reminding everyone that the applications for this year's award for inspiring young women, early career researcher women in science is open, and indeed, I think the deadline is around 20th of June. So let me start sharing my screen so I can move to the presentation straight away. Okay, so, and minimize myself. It's a strange quality of giving talks through this medium that one sees oneself giving a presentation. So I wanted to talk to you about collaborations, collaborations in research, but importantly, increasingly when I come to think about collaborations in research, it has become very clear to me that research collaborations must extend beyond the research ecosystem itself, beyond research community, in order to be effective and actually in order to secure a more fruitful, worthwhile future for research itself. And perfect. So let me start with a bit of history, my own sort of way of getting into this thinking. So a couple of years ago, Nature celebrated its 150th anniversary. And at that time, thinking back to look at the evolution of science, I began to think about who it is that does science. Who did science back then when Nature was first launched, and who does science today? And of course, the picture is deliberately, that I'm sharing with you here, is deliberately overemphasizing, and before anybody raises the point, I am of course perfectly aware of the fact that Newton was around just a few years before Nature was launched. But I put this slide together to illustrate the point. At the time when Nature was launched in 1869, science was done by individuals, essentially from one ethnic and cultural background, and indeed effectively exclusively by men. Today, the picture is very different. But then after I gave a few presentations using this sort of entry into the topic of the importance of diversity in science, not just in terms of who does it, but also how the questions that are posed, how that diversity influences the questions that are posed, I then of course realized that this picture is not right either, because the reality is like this. Individuals very rarely do science. Science is, of course, as you well know, because you practice it yourselves, is a team effort. Yes, everybody works on the project, but nobody works in isolation. And so the pandemic, of course, has given us an amazing insight. And by us, I mean not just within the research community, but the whole global society, into how important collaboration is. I have no doubt that all of you will appreciate this, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves that the only reason why we have a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 that was developed within 10 months in a completely unprecedented order of magnitude, greater speed than previously for any vaccine, is because, first of all, there was immediate collaboration among scientists to determine the genomic sequence of the virus, subsequent collaboration to determine the structure, and then, of course, subsequent collaboration between research in academia, but also in the private sector. But it doesn't end here. Of course, it extends beyond to the willingness to cooperate and collaborate on the part of the regulators. In this particular example, FDA and EMA are mentioned. Of course, the collaboration between the private sector and the public sector is nothing new, and I know that you have a discussion panel scheduled to happen after this presentation. And here I'm just sharing with you another example that I am particularly familiar with because of my background in genetics and genomics, as you heard during my introduction by Tomek. So open targets, some of you may be familiar with this. Essentially, it's a large-scale multi-year public-private partnership that uses human genetics and genomics to find and prioritize drug targets. And it's a collaboration, as it shows at the bottom of the slide, or a consortium, if you like, of private sector representatives and academic institutions. But of course, the example of the pandemic illustrates how important it is to look to cross-disciplinary collaborations. Just realized I might have had another slide to illustrate my point. Indeed, I managed to skip that slide. So as I started talking about cross-disciplinary collaborations, what I found particularly instructive was to look at how many different disciplines published in the topic associated with COVID pandemic. Using Dimensions database, I did an extraordinary simple search, simply using the term COVID, even without any time limitations. Very clearly, this is a new term. And you can see, unsurprisingly, that the largest number of publications have fallen into the disciplines such as medical and health sciences. But then very quickly, You see studies in human society, psychology, of course, basic science, then education, economics, and then you go into engineering, physical sciences, etc., etc. And so moving forward to the slide that I was on just a second ago, my point was that the vaccine development itself, of course, illustrates beautifully how without engagement with the social sciences, the benefits of developing a vaccine could be compromised or certainly not fully realized, because we need social scientists, behavioral scientists to help us mobilize civil society to actually take up the vaccine which has been developed. But public health is clearly not the only example, and the current pandemic is not the only crisis that faces us. And so I wanted to show you a couple of other examples now from the Sustainable Development Goals agenda. Of course, the goals themselves established, put into place some 6 years ago in 2015, and they themselves, each of them, of course, is multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, if you like, but there are also other disciplines that span more than one of the already very complex targets within these SDGs. And one example I wanted to share with you here is about the oceans. So oceans themselves, there isn't a single SDG that it's devoted to the oceans, but they touch on a number of them. Some associated with freshwater, or rather, sorry, aquatic organisms, others with equality and diversity, economic growth, etc., etc. So what I'm illustrating for you here is actually a collection of articles which we published in Nature towards the end of last year. And it was a really, if not unprecedented, and certainly a rare example of 14 world leaders who have come together specifically to assemble an international group of researchers to look at where the ocean economy goes in the future, or rather where it can go, so ocean economy is sustainable, thereby benefiting both economic growth that comes from the ocean, but also maintaining ocean health and biodiversity within the ocean. So the group called themselves High Level Panel on Sustainable Ocean Economy. They represented 14 different countries, and they themselves assembled a panel of experts. This panel of experts, in turn, worked with local communities to draw on their knowledge in order to come up with a set of recommendations and policies that, in turn, these governments publicly adopted. And so the work of researchers, really side by side with now governments and policymakers, led to very specific political action. And so based on this evidence that was accrued and analyzed, as I say, 14 world leaders, and you see on the map here where they came from, committed to the sustainable management of all of their national waters by 2025. What they also committed to was to become ambassadors for similar kind of stewardship of the oceans in the geographic regions where they are. Another example of political agenda and political will, which is very closely underpinned by research. And so I see this as a collaboration between researchers and politicians and decision makers, is in the arena of food sustainability and food system. And so later this year, in the autumn, I believe in September, the UN is holding a food system summit. And the food system summit has a scientific group, which was appointed by the UN envoy who is in directing the food system summit. And this scientific group is collaborating on collecting original data, performing original analyses, that will directly feed into policy making as part of the this UN Food System Summit. And there is so here's an example of just one aspect of what's happening in the run-up to the Food System Summit, a series of events which we refer to as Food Systems Summit Dialogues. I was fortunate enough to be part of one set of these dialogues, but the beauty of them is how inclusive and collaborative they were. So some 40 of these sessions have already taken place right across the globe, across the continents, and they included a number of different constituents or a number of different stakeholders, including civil society, including farmers, including fishermen, as well as researchers and policymakers in these different parts along the globe. The reason why the geographic spread is important is because ultimately the sort of global solutions will of course come from local policies, which will need to be developed collaboratively so that they are maximally implementable. Another example, again under the SDG umbrella of collaboration, is IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Diversity and Ecosystem Services. And there again, there is a research arm to it, as well as a business and commercial, financial part to it, but there is also a civil society component to this panel. And certainly when reports are prepared by IPBES, all of these stakeholders feed into the reports and recommendations. But not all examples of collaborations that I want to show you come from sustainable development goal space or public health space. We can look for examples of incredibly important and successful collaborations within the basic sciences. SESAME, the synchrotron light for experimental science and applications in the Middle East. An example from basic science, from particle physics. What's incredible about this organization is, I think, evident from just looking on the map here. And this is an example of incredible diplomatic benefit of collaborative science. What other table for discussions can you imagine that brings these representatives of these countries to the same table for discussions and for moving forward topics with a common agenda and common interest? So a word on the impact of collaborations. There is quite a body of scholarly evidence to suggest that impact in terms of citations, in terms of promoting and advancing ideas, so how ideas are built on, comes from more collaborative, large groups who work together towards a common problem. There is also recent research, and one example I'm showing is from Nature Human Behavior, that originality and multidisciplinary aspect of the research is associated also with the dynamics with which these collaborations grow and how collaborators come in and out of collaborative groups of teams. Just to be clear, collaborations are not necessarily about size. I would in fact argue what's more important in collaborations is in fact that diversity of stakeholder perspective, depending on what it is that collaboration is focusing on. And one example, just to illustrate that it's not all about size of the groups, is a paper that we published in Nature a couple of years ago, proposing that large teams develop science and technology, but when it comes to disruption, it's actually smaller teams that are more successful at achieving that. And perhaps it goes without saying, but when we are going to talk about collaborations, they need to be equitable. So it's very easy to imagine, and in fact, unfortunately, researcher colleagues from the Global South often fear that North-South collaborations lack equity in the way they're established, and lack equity when it comes to providing adequate credit for the contribution to the collaboration. And so I'm showing you two examples of something which appeared in pages of Nature on the top right-hand side. This is quite an old example, a news piece which we published in the year 2000. And then another very recent example, correspondence submitted to Nature Medicine, where the African researchers were essentially protesting against lack of recognition for research that happens in African countries when it comes to research that's pertinent to the African continent. And the third example on this slide comes from PLOS Biology. That paper looked at differences in collaboration patterns across disciplines, career stage, and gender. And to me, what was particularly interesting in that paper was indeed the different patterns in collaboration between men and women, the fact that women's collaborative networks tend to be smaller. They co-author papers with fewer co-authors as a result of this. Often the research in an academic sense, in the sense of citation visibility in academia, unfortunately tends to have lesser impact. So some really interesting observations that of course lead one to prompt to think why that is, and how should that discrepancy be removed. One cannot talk about collaborations without, or rather often when one talks about collaboration, one talks about collaborations between countries, researchers from different countries. And unfortunately, there are plenty of examples where politics gets in the way. Here, a couple of very recent examples of antagonistic relationships which unnecessarily disrupt what otherwise could be very fruitful collaboration between researchers, in one case Taiwan and China, and Chinese American scientists within the US itself. I spoke right at the beginning of the presentation, I spoke about public health, and specifically the example of the current pandemic. Here is another example of this time a policy event, the Global Health Summit, which is coming up at the end of May this year in Rome, organized by the European Commission. And this summit, as well as having an established panel of scientific experts, the summit itself is going to look to preparedness for future pandemics and other similar health crises. It has a panel of scientific experts, but it also has conducted a consultation with civil society on sustainable health security, preparedness, and response. And both of these documents, the result of the consultation and the recommendations from the scientific expert panel, will feed into the summit and into the Rome Declaration principles, which the summit is hoping to establish. Now, this is an example of where the civil society is consulted on something which has already been sketched out or proposed, devised previously. There are some really interesting growing examples of co-production of research with individuals, members of the society, who are themselves not formally trained in research or in science. And very interesting examples from across different disciplines, across different sectors in science. In each case, the non-expert contributors to this co-production are those individuals who are directly touched by the research in questions, and so they become partners in this research. And this was a particular focus which we ran at Nature in the autumn of 2018, looking at co-production in public health, in clinical trials. Patients are increasingly involved in designing clinical trials that, of course, will be directly relevant to them. But equally, patient groups and their families are increasingly involved in evaluating funding proposals for research. Again, something very interesting to have that perspective from the individuals who in the end stand to benefit from the results of this research. And other examples that we looked at 3 years ago or so were, for example, that of farmers or fishermen, where the results of evidence and research-based policy were going to touch their lives directly. So something that would really influence whether that research was in fact applicable or not. Funders are beginning to set up initiatives that foster collaborations across disciplines, but also across geographies. Here, a couple of examples of initiatives from the NIH in the US. H3 Africa is one of them, which is focusing on genomics and genetic resources and building capacity and infrastructure in Africa. And the one which I'm showing you an example of on the left-hand side is, again, an NIH project looking at harnessing data science for health discovery and innovation in Africa. Again, involved in or designed to create capacity, to create training, and subsequently, one hopes to lead up to much more equitable collaborations, either within the continent or from the continent towards outside of it as well. And I will, that's my penultimate slide, where I wanted just to show you how we within the publishing world are trying to address this opportunity of collaborations across disciplines and across sectors. So a little bit similar to how the vast majority of university departments are arranged, many of the journals which we initially launched within, back then, Nature Publishing Group, now Springer Nature, but within the Nature portfolio, fell along the lines of very traditional disciplines. So one of the first journals was Nature Biotechnology and Nature Genetics. I mentioned Nature Medicine. Of course, there's Nature Physics, and I'm sure you're familiar with many others. But in recent years, we have decided to create homes for interdisciplinary research. Even if the individual researchers themselves still identify as practitioners of a particular discipline, they increasingly come together with practitioners of other disciplines to address some of the most complex problems that face us today. And so now we have journals such as Nature Energy and Nature Food and Nature Sustainability. And in this row of examples at the bottom, Nature Aging is the most recent journal that we've added to this table of the journals, so that we can provide this home for multidisciplinary research, but increasingly interdisciplinary. So research which cannot easily be sort of pigeonholed, if you like, to any one particular discipline. So with this, I will stop, and I will again reiterate that, in my view, sustainable future can only be achieved through equitable and inclusive collaboration. It also directly will help our knowledge discovery, will help the way that we ask questions, how we pose them, and importantly, how we go about addressing them. So in other words, as well as contributing to sustainable future, collaborations will improve quality of the research which we do. And with this, I will stop sharing my screen and take any questions. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Magdalena. That was a great and very insightful talk. I see already there are a few questions, but before I will give floor to others, I would like to ask the question myself. And I was wondering, because I think like scientists have, as far as I know scientists, we have like the collaboration we have almost like embedded in our DNA. At least that's what I would like to think about it. But then when it comes to the like acknowledgements or like scientific prizes, like Nobel Prize, the breakthrough prizes, all of them are usually still in an old-fashioned approach that, for example, Nobel Prize will never be awarded to one of the greatest discovery in physics, because simply you cannot just choose 3 people who were responsible for the discovery. And I wonder if this is slightly not counterproductive, this approach that the prizes or acknowledgement only most of the time goes to 1 or few people, even though the effort is very collaborative, like you pointed out many examples. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that, or maybe this is changing.
Absolutely, it's a fantastic question, and I think it's a real issue. It's so much easier to glorify an individual who very clearly, as you said, not only has worked in the context of a laboratory, maybe an institute, with a whole team behind them, but of course, research of so many others have contributed to their individual success. It's easy to identify an individual. With Nobel Prizes, of course, such a great example because they're so prominent. And there are so many examples of individuals who are bypassed. The community, almost every year, the community from which the Nobel Prize winner emerges will have ongoing discussions. What about this person? What about this person? Has another person been bypassed? In our own pages, some of you may be familiar, at the end of the year, in the very final issue of Nature, we have a feature which we only publish once a year called Nature's 10. And historically, when we started this particular feature, it's about 10, 12 years old now, we really focused on individuals. We really said, you know, these were the people who mattered in that particular year. And it was very much along the lines of, you know, we always understood, of course, that these were the individuals who symbolized something that mattered. But actually, as time has gone on, we realized that it's not a particularly helpful analogy. So we continue to evolve this Nature's 10. Yes, we still talk about individuals, but we talk about them as embodying a much larger, be it invention or movement or something similar. I think it's a very important point that you make. It's also an important point because, of course, we don't have true inclusion in science. So individuals from certain backgrounds tend to be more prominent as sort of prominent faces to certain discoveries or advancement of knowledge in particular topics. For that reason, again, most of the prizes tend to go to men. They tend to go to individuals from with European descent, as opposed to the underrepresented individuals in research, who of course do excellent research themselves as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I will try to now choose. I think the first one was Magda with raised hand. So I think I can allow. Yes, I think you can. Oh, okay.
Hello. Yeah, do you hear me?
We can.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you very much for an amazing talk. I have a few points all related to equity you're touching upon a bit. So I see that this indeed, like just like you mentioned, is happening a bit, but it's still very faulty. These collaborations with like global north and south are still very faulty and diverse because, for example, I'm based in Germany, and here we do have research grants which are supposed to promote collaboration, for example, with some African country. However, the amount of money which a German partner will get versus what the African partner will get is ridiculously out of proportion. Secondly, I guess you probably hear this point a lot, but I believe that open source and open science is sort of still hindering research being conducted in the global south. I mean, even when I was still a student back in Poland, I very frequently came across a paywall to read a new most exciting paper. And this seems to be also a huge problem for those developing countries. Even if they get onto some research grant, they are really disadvantaged financially, and also when it comes to what resources they can get. And as a consequence, like ERC research grants from the EU are every year the top nationality getting them are Germans, probably not because they're the smartest, but just because they already have the resources, they have the fancy machines, and they do have access to journals, and it's just like feed-forward loop. How can we sort of break this system?
Yes, you raise two very important points. So the first point about funding, indeed, it's incredibly frustrating, as you say, that on the one hand, there is funding. So there is a positive element to this, because of course there is funding which directly, I'm assuming as a condition of the funding, you need to set up a collaboration, for example, with someone in Africa. But then you have the asymmetry of the resources that the partners get. And so immediately that introduces inequality to this partnership. It is a real issue. And in many ways, in this context, but in many other contexts, the solution, while not easily implementable, but the perfect solution would be if there was sufficient funding for research within Africa. Now, that, of course, is not an easy issue, because a lot of the funding that we talk about comes from a public purse, from the governments. And of course, many governments in Africa, I think we would all agree, have much more immediate burning priorities. So investing in research would in many cases alleviate their problems in the long term, but in the meantime, they have to solve them in the short term. Many, including actually us in our pages in Nature, have called for philanthropic funding to be set up within Africa. There is money in Africa in private hands in businesses. Those businesses and private individuals or foundations are still surprisingly reluctant to invest in research. I think there is an opportunity for them to be lobbied, quite frankly, that investing in research on the continent is worthwhile and important. And the first obvious reason for it is that, of course, if you have your own homegrown funding, then you really are in a position to set the agenda. At the moment, there is a lot of funding that comes into Africa from outside of Africa, of course. And your second point about open science, although you specifically talk about open access to publications, that's also a very important point. And it's an interesting one. There are many levels to this. So for example, with open access, many publishers, including Springer Nature, which is the publisher of Nature, is a partner of Research for Life or Hinari. So researchers who are based in certain countries defined as low-income countries by the World Bank automatically gain free access to our publications. So they don't have to have a subscription. But of course, there will be countries that are beyond that boundary. They're not necessarily able to afford subscriptions, that will not benefit from this arrangement. Just a brief comment about open science, and this is a sort of a plea from me to you, active researchers. You may have come across commentators within research from the Global South that they don't actually see open science in the sense of sharing data as necessarily a positive thing, because essentially what they fear is that it's a sort of a sort of new version of colonialism within research. And what that means in turn is that they will provide the data and openly share them, but the partners in the global north, who are indeed better resourced, will then effectively use these data, and the data generators in this context coming from the global south will not get sufficient credit. And so my plea to you as researchers is to be very sensitive to how much credit you give, that the credit that you give to your collaborators, regardless of where they come from, is indeed in line with their contribution. There is a role for us as editors to play here, but first and foremost, the research community, I think, needs to be a bit more sensitive to that. But these were excellent points. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. There are so many questions that I have a feeling that we could at least 1 hour spend on the different discussions. I'll try to choose the ones with the largest number of likes. So that's your chance. If you like a particular question, just you can vote like this. So the first one on the list now is from, it changes very rapidly. That's kind of funny. Now it's from Iza Kowalczyk. Thank you for a very interesting talk. I was surprised that according to published studies, you show it really continues to be that women scientists collaborate less. What is your opinion what in your opinion is the reason for this? Is this really a cultural private aspect?
So I have to confess that I was also surprised to see that. And I'm not sure what is meant by private aspect, but I suspect that my understanding of the cultural aspect is probably something that accounts quite a lot for it. If you think about how collaborations continue to be set up and co-authorship continues to be set up, a lot of it arises from pre-existing networks. And so many pre-existing networks favor men in creating interactions. If you look at learned societies, if you look at senior appointments in, let's say, learned societies or in learned institutions, thus far they continue to be largely occupied by men. And so the made nodes, if you like, in that network of interactions remain male. Now, over time, of course, this is changing. You know, one of the things that we've seen, you know, I mentioned right at the beginning that Nature celebrated 150th anniversary a couple of years ago. And of course, we were looking at how the gender of our authors over time, or rather the proportion of women in our pages has changed. We couldn't look all the way back to the very beginning of Nature, because in fact, at that time, only initials were used, or for the first name, only the initial was used in publication. But we went back to look to sort of 1980, more or less. And certainly the proportion of women publishing in our pages has grown. Right now is around 30%, which is commonly accepted to be the proportion of women in active research today. Now, that clearly is not enough. So I think over time we will see this increase. But I would imagine that the reason why women collaborate less as measured by co-authorship, right? Importantly, that's what that paper showed, is because of the structure of these networks.
Okay, great, thank you. I think maybe we have quite time for one more question. So it's from Monika Zbytniewska. How would you encourage young researcher at the level of PhD to engage in collaborations? I have a feeling that this is often decided at the PI professor level.
So I think, you know, very early career researchers, I think, have more power than they realize. What I would really strongly emphasize is that it's important to realize your own agency, your own ability to direct the dynamic with which you're doing a PhD. If you have problem convincing your PI that your research needs to be collaborative, then as I mentioned, I just showed a sprinkling of examples, but there is now plenty of examples to show that collaborative research is more impactful. Now, the impact in academia as measured by citations is of course important in many cases, in my view, over too much importance is associated with citations in academia, but that's by and large what continues to be used when it comes to being considered for promotion and tenure track positions. So that can be a very persuasive argument for a PI. But equally, this is an opportunity for you or those other early career researchers to actually build a much healthier research ecosystem, because of course it's this generation who are starting their PhDs, who are doing their PhDs, and the generations of postdocs as well, who are really creating the research ecosystem as they go along. So it's a tremendous opportunity, and I would say, put the pressure, and if it needs to be, if you need to illustrate it with published research, that it's worth it.
Great. Okay, I think there are many questions, but unfortunately we have to move to the next part of our agenda, which is the discussion panel. So once more, Magdalena, I would like to very much thank you for your great talk and amazing discussion afterwards. There are some questions in the Q&A. Maybe if you have time, just you can have a look and maybe some brief answers for them. I'm guessing that some of them are quite complex. I don't know if it's possible to answer them, but yeah. Thank you very much again, and I hope.
Thank you.